Those who haven't met me, I've been working for Speyside Wildlife now for nearly 25 years, I think it will be. Um, so yeah, fair old time. And we've been doing this British Columbia trip for quite a few years. I put it together a long time ago, and we've tweaked this a little bit since then. So I was even tweaking this talk this morning because the holiday has actually changed slightly since the last time I led it. But we'll tell you all about that when we get to those relevant parts. So we actually, it is all in British Columbia, this trip. But British Columbia's a very large, I was going to say county, state. Well, I'm not sure what they call them in Canada. But it's a large area. And actually, when I've done this talk, sometimes I've actually called it Vancouver Island because we spent almost all our time down there in the bottom left inside that red circle on Vancouver Island itself. So yes, it's British Columbia, but actually we don't visit hardly any British Columbia really. It's just that tiny bit in the bottom corner there. And if we zoom in on Vancouver Island, we have kind of four bases really on the trip. So we fly into Vancouver itself. We have a day locally just around that area. And then pretty much the rest of the holiday, we are on Vancouver Island. So if you see that dot where Vancouver is, that is on a wonderful reserve called the George C. Rifle Migratory Bird Sanctuary. Bit of a mouthful. And it's a wonderful start to the holiday. And I'll be honest that a lot of the holiday is based around seeing mammals. We're looking for cetaceans, so some whales and dolphins and things. We're looking at bears. We're looking at all sorts of mammals. However, there are some very good birds as well. And actually, this site is probably the birdiest place that we go to on the whole holiday, and it's straight in there on day one. It's got a real mix of habitats. You can see there are some ponds and lakes and things. If you could see further left, you'd be looking out over a huge salt marshy area with lots of cat's tail type stuff, as it's called. There's bits of woodland, there's meadows, there's just a huge variety of habitats in a very small space. And as a result, there's a lot of different birds. And it's a fabulous reserve. It's famous for its sandhill cranes. They get very large numbers that spend the winter there. Also, huge numbers of snow geese in the winter, and a couple of times we have squeaked in a snow goose or two. They're literally just arriving, but there's a lot of ducks and a lot of other things. And there's the sandhill cranes at the top there in flight. Great horned owl nest there, and usually we manage to find them roosting up in the trees. It's a big owl, that way bigger than our tawny owl, almost eagle owl size, I would say. That's Carolina wood duck in the middle there, and there's a lot of small birds as well. So there's things like chickadees and a lot of different sparrows and juncos and things like towies, all sorts of stuff. So it's a fabulous reserve with a lot of wildlife and a really great start to the holiday, really. We have seen raccoons there. Northern harriers hunt out over the marsh, and you've got Allah's hummingbird at the bottom right there. They can either just have a little red patch on their throat like that if they're young birds, or the whole head can be that colour. They're quite spectacular. And there are hummingbird feeders outside the visitor centre, and usually there's still one or two hummingbirds left. They're about to migrate at that time of year, so we're just catching the last two or three before they leave. But usually we get really nice views of those. It's a fabulous reserve for waders as well, or shorebirds if you're American. And as you can see, that top picture there is a real mix of waders in there. And if you look at that top part of the picture, the birds with the very, very long beaks are long-billed dowitchers. I think there might be a short-billed in there, possibly. There's one on the left there that looks like its billy slightly kinked, which is typical of short-billed. Western sandpiper is forming the bulk of the smaller birds, but there's also a few semi-palmated sandpipers in there. And if you study the bills, you'll see some of them are long and slim and slightly curved, and others are noticeably shorter. So I don't know whether you can see my arrow if I do this, but that one there, for example, has a very short bill, so that's going to be a semi-palmated sandpiper. There's usually greater yellow legs, lesser yellow legs. That's a stilt sandpiper at the bottom left there, rather special to see. So some great birds. So we have a great day there. See lots of stuff. It's a really good start. but not many mammals. That's going to come next. And we head now over to the island. There's a ferry that goes from pretty much where that dot is actually over to Nanaimo, which you can see in the sort of south east of the island, really. And then from Nanaimo, we travel all the way up that road that follows right up to the other end of the island, where the next red dot is up near Port McNeill. So it's a long day, a long drive. But then once we're there, we've got a bit of time to relax in the most delightful surroundings. This is us bird watching from the ferry as we head across. And I should say, what we're crossing there, the St. Johnstone Strait, it has orcas. And that's one of the things we're going to go and look for next. But occasionally we've actually seen them from the deck of the ferry. And we usually see a nice mix of birds, sometimes some skuas even, but gulls and auklets and things like that. And then we stay in this absolutely beautiful lodge. And you can see there the view out of the window. Notice that sort of jetty that's out there and a nice sort of bay with lots of rocky stones and stuff. And that's all very relevant because even whilst you're just sitting there enjoying a cup of coffee or a beer or whatever is your drink of choice, you can look out the windows and at low tide, the black bears come out and they spend a lot of time turning over stones on the beach looking for crabs, things like that, anything they can eat. And it's astonishing. I've even watched them before now. Um, they'll, God knows what this does to their teeth, but I've even seen them scraping barnacles off these rocks with their teeth. And you think, goodness me, that doesn't sound like a very appetizing meal, does it? But I've certainly seen them doing that. And there's often with little babies as well. This is a cute little baby black bear. They wander around all around the hotel, which sounds unnerving, but actually they're remarkably shy. And I've seen the guy that owns the place a couple of times. He's been looking out the window, and we've had a black bear wandering by, and he said, "Oh, I don't want it to go in there. That would be a real pain." And he just goes outside and shoos it off, and you think, really? So yeah, they seem to be quite nervous of people, and I have come face to face with a black bear there, and it immediately turned tail and ran away. So either I'm more frightening than a black bear, or they are just very nervous animals, and they just don't seem to be as dangerous as they're sort of credited to be. I don't think. I suspect the issue would be if you got between a mother and its cubs or something. But we are just very careful, and we tend to walk around in a group, so that makes life much safer. But seeing them up close is just fabulous. On that jetty that I pointed out that you can see out of the windows that we were sat at there, we sometimes see these. This is American river otter, quite closely related to our otter. It's they'll go in the sea as well as in rivers, just like ours do. So this isn't the sea otter. We'll come to those later. But very chilled out. They'll often just curl up on that jetty there and have a sleep, or sunbathe lying on their back. It's a very relaxed looking otter, isn't it? Belted kingfisher are really easy there. We see a lot of those flying backward and forward. And a nice selection of birds actually can be in the garden. So just around the hotel, we can do little short walks, and all of these birds can be there as well as others. The top two are often more migrating through. So Townsend's warbler, black-throated grey warbler, and other warblers as well can be amongst them. Stella's jays are all over the place. They're very nice. And we usually check through the American robins for a bird called varied thrush that we're hoping to see. They can be really, really tough, but I'll show you a photo of one later at another spot where we see them. But we have seen them at this lodge as well. And there's lots of little tiny green things. So I like birding because you can ooh and ah at the stunningly beautiful American warblers, but then you can also have a lot of fun trying to tell a Hutton's vireo from a ruby-crowned kinglet. All good fun. But yes, lots of other stuff to look out for. And we do have a site not that far from there where there are beavers. And I was saying I had to tweak this talk a tiny bit to match what we do now compared to last time I gave it, because we used to go to another hotel which had beavers fairly close to it. But th as things have changed, there's sort of less and less that we see from that hotel that we don't see somewhere else. which I might explain later on. And Darren and Julian discovered a place with beavers much closer to this lodge, so we've actually stopped going to that other hotel now, and we do it all from where we based, which is lovely because it's a such a nice hotel. Everybody has always said, "Ooh, can't we stay there longer?" So now we do. The big the big excitement really from there is doing boat trips into St. John's Strait, St. Johnson Strait. It's big target there really is orcas. That's the thing we're hoping to see there that you've got less chance of seeing elsewhere. And we used to do a boat trip into there and then another boat trip from this other hotel I mentioned. But now we've decided it's makes more sense to do two boat trips from here because you've got so much to see. And what we saw from the other hotel, we're now going to see later on in the holiday. I'll explain that when we get there. So we go out on a boat, something like this. It's not just us, but it's not a huge number of people. And we see lots of stuff, and it's in just the most beautiful scenery. This is looking back across towards the mainland, where the beautiful mountains and forests and stuff. And as we get out there, okay, the big target is trying to see orcas, but there's lots of other stuff to look for, and there's a lot of birds. The ones at the back might look familiar. They are guillemots, basically. But over there, they don't call them guillemot, they call them common mure. So if you hear anybody talking about common mures, that's what they're talking about. In the foreground, these are a bird called a rhinoceros auklet. So they're smaller than a guillemot, probably about puffin sized. And you're looking at them there thinking they don't bear a lot of resemblance to a rhinoceros. However, in full breeding plumage, they look rather like this. I wouldn't say they're the most beautiful of birds, but you see that little blip on the top of his nose. That's not a little white fly that's landed on his nose. That's actually a little bit of horny stuff which sticks up from the top of the bill. It's very strange. And that's why it's got the name, is it has this little horn on top of its bill, a little bit like a rhinoceros. That's about the only coincidence with a rhinoceros. The rest of it is nothing like one. But still, they're rather nice to see, and I always get quite excited about those. The other little orky thing that we see there, if we're lucky to get views as close as that, but this is one called marbled murelet. So if you remember, we said the guillemot's called a mure, common mure. This is a murelet, so it's like a little tiny mure. And there are several species of these, but the one that's most common in that area is marbled murelet. So cool because they are a sort of marbled colour in breeding plumage. They're brown and speckly with a sort of marbling on them. They molt into a totally black and white plumage for the winter, and this bird's mid-molt really, so it's still got some speckling underneath. Be completely white underneath by the winter, and they're tiny. They're really really small, sort of smaller than a little orc, even very tiny little things, very delicate looking, and I really like them. These are red-necked phalaropes, and if you're from the UK, you feel very delighted if you get to see a redneck phalarope at all. So we've been here sometimes and seen literally thousands, like 2,000 in one flock and stupid things like that. It's not always like that. Sometimes there's far fewer, but they can be in really large numbers. And you'll get a whole flock flying by. And in the UK, we'd be used to thinking, oh, they must be Dunlin. And then you suddenly realize they all land on the water and all start spinning around looking for food. And you think, goodness me, they're all phalaropes, which would be quite remarkable if you were here. So yeah, very nice. They breed in the Arctic, and so they're kind of migrating south, and they're just gathering there before they move on, really. As are the birds at the top there. This is sooty shearwaters, and again, sometimes thousands of them, sometimes a few hundred, but usually thousands. And you can disturb vast rafts of these off the water, and they'll come cruising around you. It's really, really spectacular to watch. Again, it's a bird that, you sit on a headland in the UK hoping you might get a glimpse of one, and here you see hundreds and hundreds. It's fabulous. And then now and again, you might get one of these fork-tailed petrels go by, which I've never managed a really good photo of one. That's the best I've done so far. And they're rather lovely. They're a nice kind of lead and grey colour, but with a white rump and this sort of M shape, a bit like a young kittiwake on the wings, and a little bit of a dark mask. So they're really pretty. But they are, a storm petrel of types. So if you imagine a grey leech's petrel, then it's kind of a bit like that. The divers, or loons as they call them over there, are just fantastic. We get a lot of great northern divers, which they would call common loon. And at that time of year, some of them might be molting, some of them are going to be young birds, but a lot of them are still in breeding plumage and looking just like that. Absolutely spectacular. Redneck grebes have still got rednecks. A few years ago, what we call black-throated diver was split into two species. So anything in the Atlantic or around us is still black-throated diver. Over on the Pacific side, in the Pacific Ocean, it's a separate species now called Pacific diver or Pacific loon, and they are still very similar, but they have this really pale back to the head, almost white on the back of the head, and the billy's noticeably smaller and shorter. They're just really rather attractive. They don't have that. If I don't know how many of you are familiar with the identification of black-throated diver, but at the back end, where roughly where the legs are, they have like a white patch, which a lot of bird watchers refer to as a wheel arch, little white wheel arch, and they don't have that either. So even in non-breeding plumage, you can still identify them. They have that small bill, no wheel arch, and you can see you've got a little tiny black chin strap, little dark brown chin strap, which is for some odd reason that's a feature that they keep right through the winter. So we hope to see all of those. I am absolutely not promising that. This is a blue-footed booby, and on one occasion we were on the boat in this strait there looking for orcas and stuff, and suddenly there's this bird on the water. I'm like, what? What is that doing here? At the time, I was astonished because this is hundreds and hundreds of miles away from where it should be. Um, Julia and I were astounded really is the word because we weren't sure how many there had ever been that far north. And when we researched it, it turned out this was the first ever for Canada, not just British Columbia, but anywhere in Canada at all. So I think it's still the only first for any country that I've ever found. So we were just beside ourselves excitement with this thing. Blue-footed booby, sort of thousands of miles away from where it should be. So a great, great day that was. But yeah, I don't expect that one. But I couldn't help telling you the story because it was so exciting. Coming more around to what, well, some of the bigger targets of it really are some of the cetaceans whilst we're in that bay there. And they start with the smallest one, which is harbour porpoise, which is exactly the same species that we get around the UK. But there's a second species of porpoise, and we're so used to seeing our porpoise just kind of gently roll across when you see it's Dahl's porpoises are really fast. So when they hit the surface, they actually make quite a splash. And it can sometimes be quite hard to identify them for that reason. They're almost hidden amongst the splash they've made. But if you do get a decent view as they go over, they're black and white, and they actually have a white dorsal fin, like a little white triangle. So you can see that in the picture there, quite distinctive. It's a big porpoise, probably the biggest. But this is the target. This is the one that, I would be gutted if we did this trip and didn't see these. And this is orca or killer whale, if you prefer. Personally, I quite like the name orca more. I don't know why. And there's more than one pod of orcas that are resident in Johnston Strait. And the area you go into, they've actually got a couple of pods that they can kind of identify. So I'll talk a bit more about it in a second, but it's just so thrilling. You go out there, you're in this little boat, and suddenly you're in amongst these things, and they don't seem bothered at all by the boat. Sometimes we've been there for an hour or two with them circling the boat constantly, just fishing away or searching for what they're looking for. And that huge dorsal fin on the males is just so distinctive. There's nothing else like it. If I was standing on the back of that whale, top of my head would be level with the top of that fin. That's roughly the size we're talking about. It's almost 6 foot tall. So it's just a spectacular animal. Quite often you just see the fin cruising through the water. And then in the same area, we'll often get these. This is Pacific White-sided dolphin. And the next shot, I still can't believe I got that shot. I mean, it was such a calm day that day when we were out, and you could see them right through the water completely clearly. And the interesting thing here is that If you look at that picture, that is an orca with a white-sided dolphin swimming along right beside it. And you might think, oh my goodness, you don't want to do that. That's very risky. But you get two kinds of orcas in the area. You get resident orcas, which are, as the name suggests, they live there all the time or most of the time. And you get a pod of those, and they are very definitely fish eaters. They would not eat a dolphin. They wouldn't eat a seal. They wouldn't eat you. They're just interested in fish. And we've also been there when you've occasionally got what they call transient orcas. Now, the transient orcas are much more travel. They don't have a kind of local patch where they live all the time. They move around over big, big areas. And they are the mammal eaters. So they will be hunting for, but they love common seals, for example. That's one of their favorite prey. But they will certainly take a dolphin. They'll certainly take a porpoise, um, anything they can get really. And as a result, now let's go back a step. We have a hydrophone on the boat, and occasionally we've popped the hydrophone down into the water so we can hear the sounds. And you can literally tell if they are resident orcas or transient orcas by the sounds. The sounds are completely different, really, really different. These may even be two species. We don't know for sure yet. Now, if the resident orcas are around, you've got really good chances of seeing these dolphins. If the transient hawkers have come in for a little while, everything scarpers. We can all hear them. So the dolphins disappear. Even the resident orcas will often disappear. But so you won't get a shot like that if it's transient orca because the dolphin wouldn't dare. I've seen these dolphins actually taking fish out of the mouth of a orca. That's how unscared of the orcas those dolphins are if they're resident ones. And occasionally we've had people on board who've have a lot of knowledge about the local animals, and they can point out on these diagrams exactly who is related to who. They've got different families, and they've all got slightly different markings or little scratches or little nicks taken out of the fins or whatever it is. So they can very easily identify which pod of orcas you've got. And I remember one year out there, and there was a lot of excitement because clearly we've got two pods of orcas together, and they were clearly having fun. And we wondered if that was, when the males from one family meet females from another family and all this sort of stuff. So that was all quite exciting. So there's a lot of knowledge out there, and they can tell you an awful lot of interest about those specific orcas. So when we finish looking at those and have had a lovely time, then we head off to look for another whale. And this is interesting because the very first time I went, I didn't see any humpback whales apart from I did a boat trip off the other side of the island straight out in the Pacific on a fast boat for an hour and a half to see a humpback whale. That was my first ever humpback whale. Now they're easy peasy. They are all over the place. They have come back really dramatically, and we get good views of humpback whale in the same area as the orcas. There seem to be little spots that they particularly favour. So these are all shearwaters in the background, by the way. Those are all the sooty shearwaters. So we trundle over to the areas that these guys prefer, and usually just cut the engines and let them come to us. And they're moving around a lot, so you at some point will get one close too. And the other thing that happens quite a bit, I don't know why there, but they seem to breach a lot. So you get to see things like this, where the animal actually launches out of the water and does a huge splash as it crashes back into the water again. Really, really spectacular stuff. I mean, look at that. It really is a spectacular sight, and I hope if any of you do choose to come with us that you get to see that because it is marvelous. These can also be identified as individuals, and that's the kind of photograph you need if you want to try and do that because it's the markings on the undertail that help. Um, they can be almost completely black under the tail, all the way through to almost completely white. And the pattern of those markings underneath is the most useful information you can get. So the guys on board are constantly trying to get photographs like that so that they can tell exactly which animals are where. And they've all got names, of course. So that's kind of the big targets really up in the north there, and there are other things, there are other birds we look for, and even other mammals and stuff. But I mean, we usually see mink, for example, which I've had guests say to me, "Oh, I don't want to look at that. I don't like mink." And then you think, "Yeah, but hang on a minute, we're in Canada. They're allowed here. That's perfectly natural. That's where they should be." So I quite like seeing mink. Um, Coming back down then, so effectively what we do on the holiday is we drive to the furthest point right at the start, and then we work our way back. And as we come back towards Nanaimo again, you come to a very nice town called Campbell River, and we've got a few things that we want to do around there. One of which is another boat ride. So fast moving boat, and we shoot off, and we actually are going back to the mainland for this visit. And the again, wonderful scenery. This is truly spectacular stuff as we're heading back to this sort of mountain and forestry scenery over on the mainland. And we go in the morning, quite often there's mist hanging in all the valleys like that. It's absolutely stunning. When we end up here, this is the end of one of the inlets, and we come to shore where we're met by some of the local tribes people there, and they take us to go and look for grizzly bears. There are no grizzly bears on Vancouver Island, which really surprised me. And they do occasionally get one, which has swum across, but they've never stayed and settled on the island. So if you want to see them, you need to come back to the mainland. And they have these rather nice viewing platforms with a nice gate at the bottom to keep the bears out. And in all honesty, though, the bears aren't interested in us at all. They're far too focused on these things. So one of the reasons we run the trip when we do is because that's when the salmon are migrating up the rivers to lay their eggs. There's different species of salmon, and the bears like them a lot. That's their big source of food to fatten themselves up before the winter when they hibernate. So their hope is that at this time of year they're going to catch lots of salmon and eat a lot of salmon so that they can put on the pounds. So looking from those platforms, or even sometimes from just on the shore, what you're hoping to see is bears walking along the side of the river, and they're kind of looking into the water all the time. They're constantly looking out there. Sometimes they go into the water itself and peer around. And they're constantly on the lookout for an opportunity to grab one of these salmon. And it's one of these places where you come back with photographs that you think, wow, did I really take that? They can look a little bit like some professional photographers taking them instead of little old me. This bear was beautiful, and it was standing right in the river, and every now and again it would do a few paces forwards and try and grab a salmon, and it clearly isn't easy. Um, the salmon, once they've laid eggs, they're very tired, and so they become easier and easier to catch as the time goes on. But the more spent they are from all their energy, the less nutrients is in them, so they prefer to catch them whilst they're still coming up. But I'm just so thrilled with that photograph. And then, bizarrely, and this is a bit I don't understand, is how often you'll see one catch one. It'll only have a few bites out of it. It seems to just target certain bits and eat a bit of the muscle, I suppose, and whatever. And quite often they leave the rest, and you just see something like this lying at the side, thinking, so the bear's literally just taken one bite out of it and then carried on looking for a better one or something. I don't know. The result is a lot of dead salmon lying around, which helps other things. So bald eagles will hang around there looking out for salmon that have been left. There'll be quite a lot of gulls. That's a ring-billed gull at the bottom there, just about to tuck into a salmon. And you might think, okay, why have you put a hummingbird there? That is Rufus hummingbird. And yes, they don't eat salmon. That's true. However, there's a quite a nice. I quite like these little ecological links with things that I find them quite fascinating. And when the bears are hunting the salmon, quite often if they catch one, they're very nervous of other bears stealing it because it's easier to steal a. If you're a big bear, it's easier to steal a salmon from a smaller bear than it is to catch one for yourself. So any smaller bears tend to, if they catch a salmon, they tend to run off instantly into the trees to eat it because they don't want it taken off them. Now, if they've gone into the trees and then they only eat a little bit of that salmon, and they drop the rest in amongst the trees, that's actually a lot of nutrients in that spot decaying into the soil and providing nutrients for the plants there. And what that hummingbird there is feeding on, and I'll be honest, I did search online for a photograph of a hummingbird doing just this. That is a bush called a salmonberry. And it's pure coincidence that it's called a salmonberry. It's not because, well, salmon berries grow well along the edges of these rivers because of all the nutrients that are dropped by the bears. Obviously, bears do what bears do in the woods, and they also drop all these salmon, and that provides nutrients for salmonberry to grow. If you're a rufous hummingbird, you're migrating north in the spring, and it's an astonishing little bird. It's absolutely tiny, and it migrates all the way up to Alaska. Now, that's a very, very long way, and you need to set off pretty early if you're going to manage to do that and get there in time to breed if you're that small. And so they actually need flowers that they can feed on en route, and salmonberry is one of them. So it's actually partly bears feeding on salmon and taking them into the woods that provides the nectar for hummingbirds. You just think is that a wonderful little link. I just think that's delightful. There's not usually a huge number of birds there. We see a few things, but American dipper is one, and obviously people love dippers. Everybody loves a dipper. American dipper, I don't think is anything like as nice as ours. It's just plain grey, really, but still worth seeing, and they behave in exactly the same way. And you remember I mentioned the varied thrush earlier on when I said that we check all the American robins for varied thrush. That's, I think, one of the most beautiful of the passerines that they get in Canada. Very, very much a Western species and very shy. It doesn't behave like our blackbirds or song thrushes hopping about in the open. This one is very, very much in the forest and stays pretty hidden. But we got that photograph one of the years when we were there, and it's probably that place that gives us your best chance. But they can pop up almost anywhere. Um, so that's one of the days from Campbell River. We also do some of the birding, particularly from Campbell River, and we head up here. This is up into an area called Mount Washington, so we're quite high. And up there, you've got some beautiful alpine meadows, which actually have some very nice flowers in them. I get quite excited about the flowers, but also some good birds. One of which is this, and it's they're just a real pleasure to find. This is grey jay. It looks very brown there, but some of them are more grey, and they are unbelievably tame, ridiculously tame. They're closely related to Siberian jay, and that behaves in exactly the same way. If you've got a bit of biscuit or some nuts or something, we usually take a few seeds with us. They will come and pinch them out of your fingers, which is just a delight, really. You can see how happy everybody is enjoying the sight of these ridiculously tame birds. There's actually three in that photograph if you look carefully. So yeah, they're just a delight. There's quite a lot of other birds possible. Sometimes it's really quiet, if I'm honest. Other times we see loads of things. This is red-breasted nuthatch. We've seen things like western tanager up there, various warblers and things. That's yellow-rumped warbler at the top left. Northern flicker is a woodpecker that behaves rather like our green woodpecker. It feeds on ants a lot on the ground. There's the Steller's jay again, and dark-eyed juncos are everywhere, and so a lot of nice birds to look out for on that walk. But it's just a real joy being up there. And then this year, no, sorry, last year, for the first time ever, and I haven't got a photograph of one because I've never seen one, but Vancouver Island marmot is actually up there, and I've looked for them and never seen them, but somehow Darren managed to actually see one last year. So I'm hoping when I go again with him later on this year that we'll actually manage to see one because I would love to see that. Really dark brown with a little white nose, looking little things. That's red-tailed hawk. We certainly see those up there. And sometimes on the drive up, I don't think I've ever seen one whilst we've been walking around the trails, but sooty grouse is it used to be a subspecies of, I think it was called blue grouse, and now it's been split. And so sooty grouse is the one that's west of the Rockies. Very, very narrow band of where it's found near the coast. There you go. That's the distribution of sooty grouse, so it's very localized. And then the coast itself, near that area around Campbell River. There's lots of little bays and places that you can scan the channel and watch stuff out there. Things like Bonaparte's gulls and various ducks and stuff. There's a lot of ducks in that picture. That's American widgeon. Usually see a few of those. It's actually in breeding plumage. Harlequin ducks are usually they're just a spectacular bird. They really are beautiful. But at this time of year, they're just molting out of that eclipse plumage. So the males aren't at their most spectacular. But if you check through a lot of them, you occasionally find one or two that have already almost completed their molt and look really, really beautiful. So some of those ones in the bottom there are getting there. That's lesser yellow legs. Killdeer. So, there's stuff to look out for. Certainly chances of waders and things, and then there's a lot of gulls. You see quite a lot of gulls on that bit of coast, and I know a lot of people are well, find gulls difficult, or they don't find them particularly exciting. I like the challenge, if I'm honest, and I do enjoy the challenge of telling them all apart. They all look pretty similar there, don't they? There are some similarities, and there are some very definite differences. Wingtip patterns and markings on bills and all sorts of things to look out for. So, Mew gull down the bottom right there is the same as our common gull. The rest we don't get in the UK, apart from very rarely. Ring-billed gull has a dark ring on its bill, but there's some interesting molt stuff going on. So if you look at that picture at the top, Thayer's and American herring gull can look quite similar, although Thayer's has a dark eye and really bright pink legs. But at the time of year we're there, American herring gull has usually started molting into its winter plumage, so it already has that brown speckly head. Whereas the Thayer's gulls, you can sometimes pick them out purely from the fact they've got this brilliant white head. At that time of year, that wouldn't work earlier in the year, but it does work at that time of year. And they just look more delicate and more friendly somehow. Um, Obviously, glaucous winged gull has that sort of grey wingtips. So there's differences in leg colour and differences in size and all sorts. But if you're keen, I'll teach you. And then there's some lovely woodland walks you can do as well. And then this is a smashing area for looking out for a few of these sorts of birds. On the island, the only chickadee is chestnut back chickadee. So that's a really nice, rich colour. And then there's woodpeckers and warblers and sparrows and all sorts of things to look out for whilst you're walking around there. And a couple of rather special woodpeckers, pileated woodpecker for its size. It's a huge bird, size of a crow. And then red-breasted sapsucker is again very, very localized. It's got a similar distribution that I just showed you for the sooty grouse. Very, very, very western. Um, and these have a really interesting, all the sapsuckers feed the same way. And the name is reasonably appropriate, actually. If you look at the tree that is on it, it's a cherry tree, and it's full of holes, if you look. And what the sapsuckers do is they drill, often in rows, rows and rows and rows of holes in the bark, which goes right through to where the sap is rising through the tree, and it leaks out through the holes. And it's quite sugary, so there's quite a lot of energy in it. So the sapsuckers drill the holes, and they actually lick as the sap comes out, and they actually drink it and lick through that, and that gives them some sugar. As it comes out and starts to dry, it gets quite sticky. And actually, insects are attracted to it because it's sweet. But at the same time, as it dries out, it gets stickier. And quite often, an insect will land on it and then think, oops, I shouldn't have done that. And they stick to it. And so the sapsuckers come back and actually pick the insects off as well. So it's pretty clever, quite a clever way of feeding. So, and you can find these trees scattered around with these holes in rows that are very distinctive. So finally, we head over to the other side of the island and the Pacific side, and we visit a lovely place called Tofino. On the way there, we do a couple of stops. This is California sea lion. There's one or two places where these often haul out of the water, and you can always tell if they're there because that's the one that you get at the circus that makes that honking noise. Very distinctive, and they just seem to do it all the time. They don't usually balance a ball on their nose, though. And then another spot we sometimes stop is here. This is a place called, well, it's colloquially known as Cathedral Grove. I think it's called Macmillan National Park or something like that. But it's Cathedral Grove to most people. And it's called that because the height of the trees and the atmosphere there is like, which you might have walking into a cathedral with that massive height to it and atmosphere. Some of the trees there are truly enormous. The biggest one is that one. You know, they're drawing of it on the left there, 76 meters tall. It really, really is ridiculously tall. And it's funny, you stand underneath some of these and look up at them, and you know they sort of disappear off up into the distance, up into the sky above you, and it's actually kind of hard to really get a feeling for it. They do look enormous, but there are a couple that have fallen down, and when you see them lying on the ground, it's somehow more obvious just how tall they are. They seem to go on forever. Absolutely enormous things. And then another spot we sometimes stop is this. This is a place called Stamp Falls. Stamp Falls has a lot of salmon moving through at that time of year. There's a big waterfall, so you usually see some of them trying to jump the waterfall, but actually it's virtually impossible for them to do it. So they've also put in a fish pass, lots of steps with little pools at each step for them to work their way from one to the next. And if you peer down through these grates, you can actually see these enormous salmon underneath you, just holding their place until they do the next step. Really spectacular. That's one trying to jump the waterfall. Got very little chance, really. And some of the Chinook salmon are really, really big. They can grow up to about 40 odd pounds in weight. And then a lot of them will hang around below the waterfall, and you can literally see hundreds of them just holding their place as they're trying to decide when to go. And they'll either try and jump the falls or go up that ladder that's there for them. But first time I went, the guy that took us there, he was saying, "Oh, you're going to love this. You'll see some salmon." And there was a bit of me thought, "Really?" And then when I got there, I was seriously impressed. It really is quite a spectacle. And then you finally reach the other coast, and it's an amazing area. It really has got some great habitat, including this beach. This is known as Long Beach. No idea why. And all that wood that you see piled up there, in a way, it shouldn't really be there. This is leftover stuff from logging. So they've done a ridiculous amount of logging out there. The vast majority of the forest has been cut down at some point, and then they gather all the logs together and they float them out onto the sea behind big tugboats. And occasionally, if a storm blows up, they lose the whole lot and they wash up on the beach. And that's what you're looking at there. These trees that they've lost that they were taking to wherever they were going to use them. But it's pretty spectacular. And it is a very long beach. And some of these beaches, I mean, you've got Long Beach, and then that runs onto another beach, and then this one's called Chesterman's Beach. And there's a lot of dog walkers and stuff, so it's not always brilliant, but at the same time, it can be. And if you get there early morning, you can sometimes see quite a lot of birds. There's often on the sea a lot of surf scoters, and there's quite often ospreys overhead. And then more waders. These are pretty much all either, they're probably all Western sandpipers with one or two semi-palmated in amongst them. So that's the kind of sight you get on the shore, semi-palmated and Western together. They are really hard to tell apart in the winter. Um, Western has a more pointed, more curved bill than semi-palmated. And then you get semi-palmated plover as well, which looks ever so like a slightly smaller version of our ringed plover. And leaf sandpipers, instead of being with the rest, are usually up on the top of the beach, sort of in amongst the seaweed and stuff. We usually try and do at least one walk in this habitat. It's actually rainforest. It gets enough rain to be classified as rainforest, though it is purely coniferous. Some really big trees again, but just beautiful atmosphere in there. And there are a few birds. You get things like winter wrens and some of the woodpeckers again, and brown creeper and things like that. A lot of nice plants to look at. There's your salmonberry again at the bottom left, salal and things like that. Some of these are more ericaceous type plants. Lots of ferns and just a nice atmosphere. And what it's a little bit hard to make out there, but if you get a tree that's fallen and then um, as it starts to break down and rot, some seed lands on top of it. It will quite often actually start to grow while it's on top of that tree trunk. And then you can see how those roots are kind of reaching down to the ground from on top. That will have been a tree that tree has then grown on top of and then rooted down either side of the trunk. Quite astonishing. High up in the trees, you get lots of very thick moss, and some of the branches, it's several inches thick. And for years and years, the marbled mulet that I showed you earlier on, nobody really knew where they bred. And then one of the guys that was doing some logging discovered a nest in amongst the moss and realized it was a marbled mulet. And it was astonishing because everybody just assumed they nested on the coast amongst boulders or on cliffs or something, but never found a nest. And they discovered that actually, no, they're nesting high up in these big trees, tucked into a little hollow that they've made in the moss. And somehow they come in at night and find this, and you think, God, that's remarkable, really. So some of these forests are actually protected, partly for that bird, because that's such a, I mean, it's incredibly bizarre when you think about it. And when you're there, you find it almost impossible to imagine this little thing like a tiny puffin-shaped thing coming in and nested in the tops of these trees. It seems so incongruous. And I really like these. These are banana slugs. It's a really, really big slug. And they can be anything from sort of a plain green colour through almost plain yellow through to these rather black ones or yellow with black blotches. So it's almost like you can take a banana at any stage of ripeness and this slug will imitate it. They're great fun. So I'll always look out for them. You always find a few and they're huge. They're really, really big. Very impressive beasts. We now do two boat trips from here. Now, in the past, we used to just do one from here. And the reason for that was because we wanted to see grey whale. So grey whale is the one big target, but we used to do a boat trip from this other hotel that went looking for sea otters. So sea otters have now increased enormously and spread around the more. So it's actually easier now to see sea otters from here. So we go out into some beautiful islands and things, lovely, lovely scenery, mountains in the background. Excuse me a sec. Really good scenery, lots of mountains, lots of forestry, lots of bald eagles and all sorts of stuff are flying around. And there's lots of these little islands, so we can actually potter in amongst all these islands and looking all this seaweed onto the rocks and the islands have a lot of different birds on them, so you can search these islands both for birds and for animals actually. So bird-wise, there's a few to look out for, particular sort of Pacific coast specialities. Like in this flock here, for example, there are three different species of cormorant. If we zoom in, you can see there's one there with an orange face. That's a double-crested cormorant. Most of the rest, with a slight pale patch on their throat, are Brandt's cormorant. And then there's one at the very far right, and I think another one at the very far left are pelagic cormorants, which are like our shag, really, very similar. With a little bit of red on the face, actually, if you can probably can't quite make it out there, it's tiny. So there's those to look out for, and then there's a bunch of waders to look out for, including these lovely black oyster catchers. They behave just like any other oyster catcher, making a lot of noise and very agitated and all the rest of it, and they sound similar, but completely black with pink legs and red bills. And then there's black turnstone, surfbird. I really like, very nice looking bird. And the trickiest one I think is probably wandering tattler. Could be quite difficult to find. But we've succeeded on those islands quite a few times. And I think by having two boat trips, we've probably upped our chances. This is one of my favourite gulls. And it's a nice one because it's really, really easy to identify with that bright red bill and grey plumage. This is Heermann's gull. Again, very, very much a very western species. This is pigeon guillemot. It's like the Pacific version of black guillemot, really. Very similar. The white patch on the wings has that little wedge of black coming into it. That's one of the useful ways of identifying it. And then this is a flock of surf scoters, and we see some really big flocks of these sometimes in the hundreds, maybe even thousands. We get odd surf scoters in the UK every year. Once they've come across, they tend to stay here and come backward and forward, so they become quite regulars. But they have this big white patch on the front of the head and usually another white patch on the back of the head as well. And this really big orange and white bill, very distinctive. And I mentioned mammals on the rocks. This is Stella's sea lion, which is a huge thing. The males are absolutely enormous. and they have a harem of females. So he's up on top of the rock there, posing there to make any other males around know that that's his spot, and all those females are his, so to keep away. So they're really worth seeing. That massive blubber all around the neck and everything, very distinctive. Whereas these are actually common seal or harbour seal, which is exactly the same species that we get in the UK. Much smaller, much easier for an orca to eat. So they really target these when they come around the rocks and things. Not there, and we have seen them there actually, but not very often. So the whale that we are hoping to see there, this is grey whale. Now these breed further south, down Baja California way, and then they feed mostly further north, but they are feeding while they're here, and they're migrating through. And at that time of year, there might only be a very small number of them, or sometimes there can be quite a few. But they're a great whale. They're another one that does tend to lift its tail when it dives, and they feed in the silt on the bottom, unlike the other whales. A lot of other whales will filter feed through the water. These actually take up a big mouthful of silt and then push out through a lot of water, and a lot of the finer silt goes out with the water, and the little crustaceans and things living in the silt tend to get trapped. And that's what they eat. So they're diving down to the bottom to feed actually on the bottom. And they are fabulous. They're covered in markings, lots of little scratches and blotches and places where barnacles have been attached or limpets or God knows what, leaving all these circular markings and stuff. And again, they're quite identifiable apparently. They also have this, which makes them quite distinctive, apart from right whales have the same, and that's this V-shaped blow. So that is really quite distinctive. And I can remember one year we had this happen, which I thought was rather lovely. We had what we decided to call a whale bow. So it's a rainbow in the blow from a whale. Pretty remarkable. And they again, we tend to just cut the engine, and quite often they'll come over and have a look at us. So really fantastic animal. And I'm going to finish off now with just a few shots of these guys because I just think they're delightful. It's a big animal, actually. This is a sea otter, and it really, really is a marine animal. So don't think of this as an otter that spends a bit of time in the sea. This is an otter that lives in the sea and almost never, if ever, comes ashore. They spend their whole time floating on the water or wrapped up in seaweed so they don't drift away or whatever. They have their babies in the water, everything. So, and they just got the cutest faces. They really are really, really delightful, and they're doing really, really well. They were completely wiped out around Vancouver Island and reintroduced, and then after that they've spread and the numbers have gone up a lot. So they're doing pretty well now. That's their favourite food, that shell thing there, which actually has a mollusk in it that is so big it can't actually completely get into the shell. It only seems to protect the most important bit of the animal, but they eat those a lot. And I think I finished with this shot. This is this is one Julian took, and I remember him bursting out laughing when he was checking his photos and saying, "Looks like it's holding its ear and sucking its thumb." But just the most gorgeous little sea otter. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope it tempts you to come with us sometime.